My brother drove 8 hours to my apartment to apologize for confessing his love but got angry when I wouldn't forgive him, then got arrested for drunk driving and my mom blames me for his problems. I need to get this off my chest because I have no idea what to do anymore. This whole situation has turned my family upside down and I keep thinking maybe I handled it wrong. I'm Tiffany, 28F, and this involves my younger brother George, 25M, and my cousin Haley, 26F. George and Haley have been together for 3 years now and got engaged last year. They're supposed to get married in 2 weeks. George and I grew up really close. Our parents divorced when I was 12 and George was 9. Dad moved across the country for work and we only saw him during summer breaks. Mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, so I basically raised George. I helped him with homework, drove him to soccer practice, made sure he ate dinner. When other kids his age were playing video games, George was telling me about his day and asking for advice about everything from school projects to girls he liked. After high school, I got a scholarship to study engineering at a university 4 hours away. George stayed home and went to community college. We talked on the phone every few days but I could tell he was struggling without me around. He started hanging out with different crowds and got into some trouble. Nothing serious, just skipping classes and staying out too late. Mom was worried sick. During my sophomore year, George started dating Haley. She's our cousin from Mom's side. Her parents live in the same town as us. Haley was always the responsible one in our extended family. She had good grades, never got into trouble, and had this way of keeping everyone in line without being mean about it. When George started seeing her, his grades improved and he stopped getting into trouble. Mom was thrilled. I was happy for them too. Haley had always been sweet to me growing up. At family gatherings, she was the one who made sure everyone felt included. When I came home for holidays, she would ask about college and actually listen to my answers. She seemed genuinely interested in my engineering classes even though she was studying to be a teacher. After I graduated, I moved to Chicago for my first job. George and Haley were still together and seemed solid. They moved in together about a year after I left. Whenever I visited home, they would have me over for dinner. Haley would cook these elaborate meals and George would tell stories about work that made us all laugh. They seemed like they had found the rhythm as a couple. 2 years ago, Haley got a teaching job at the elementary school where she had done her student teaching. George started working at a local construction company. They were talking about buying a house and getting married. Last Christmas, George called me to say he was planning to propose. He wanted my advice on rings and asked if I thought Haley would like a small ceremony or a big wedding. I told him Haley loved being around family so she would probably want something bigger. I was right. When he proposed in February, Haley immediately started planning this huge celebration. She wanted all our cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends there. She asked me to be her maid of honor, which surprised me because I thought she would choose her sister Lisa. Haley explained that even though Lisa was her sister, I was the person who had been most supportive of her relationship with George. She said I was the one who encouraged George to be a better man and she wanted me to stand beside her when she married him. I was touched by this and agreed. Planning the wedding meant I had to come home more often. I used up most of my vacation days visiting to help with arrangements. Haley had spreadsheets for everything. Guest lists, seating charts, vendor contacts, timeline for the day. She was incredibly organized but also stressed about getting everything perfect. George seemed less involved in the planning. When I asked him about it, he said Haley had everything under control and he trusted her decisions. He would sit with us while we worked on wedding stuff but usually just scrolled through his phone or watched TV. Haley never seemed bothered by this. She would make decisions and run them by him, and he would just nod and agree. 3 weeks ago, I came home for the final dress fitting and to help with last-minute details. I was staying at Mom's house but spending most of my time at George and Haley's place since that's where all the wedding materials were. We had transformed their dining room into wedding headquarters with samples, contracts, and lists covering every surface. On Friday night, we were addressing the last batch of invitations when George came home from work. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down at the table with us. Haley was telling me about the flowers when George suddenly asked if I was planning to stay in Chicago permanently. I told him I liked my job and had been thinking about buying a condo there. He got quiet and started peeling the label off his beer bottle. Haley asked if something was wrong and he said work had been stressful lately. The conversation moved on but I noticed he kept looking at me while Haley was talking. On Saturday, we spent the day running errands. George came with us to pick up the wedding favors and drop off payments to vendors. At the florist, Haley was discussing the centerpieces with the owner while George and I waited by the car. He asked if I ever thought about moving back home. I told him Chicago felt like home now but I would always visit family. He nodded but didn't say anything else. That evening, Haley's family came over for a barbecue. George was grilling burgers and seemed back to his normal self. He was joking around with Haley's dad and teasing her little cousins. Haley was running around making sure everyone had drinks and sides. I was helping her carry plates when she mentioned how lucky she felt to be marrying George. She said he was nothing like the boys she had dated before. He was steady and reliable and made her feel safe. She had watched him grow up from the wild teenager he used to be into this responsible man who worked hard and treated her well. She said she knew part of that growth came from having me as a big sister, and she was grateful for the example I had set for him. Sunday morning, I was getting ready to drive back to Chicago when George knocked on Mom's door. He said he wanted to walk me to my car. We stood in the driveway and he thanked me for everything I had done for him growing up and for helping with the wedding. He said he hoped I would visit more often after he got married because Haley loved having me around. I told him I was proud of the man he had become and that Haley was lucky to have him. He hugged me longer than usual, and when he pulled away, his eyes looked watery. I thought he was just getting emotional about the wedding. Last Tuesday, I got a text from George at 2:30 in the morning. I was already asleep and didn't see it until I woke up for work. The message was long and full of typos. He said he had been drinking and needed to tell me something before the wedding. He wrote that he had been in love with me for years. He said it started when we were teenagers and I was taking care of him. He knew it was wrong because I was his sister, but he couldn't help how he felt. When I moved away for college, he thought the distance would help him get over it. Instead, he missed me more. He said he started dating Haley because she reminded him of me. She was smart and organized and cared about family the same way I did. He thought if he fell in love with someone like me, he could forget about his feelings for me. But when I came home for wedding planning and he saw me so much, he realized he had never gotten over it. The worst part was when he wrote that marrying Haley felt like settling for second best. He said she was a good person but she wasn't me. He asked if I had ever thought about him the same way and if there was any chance we could be together. I read the message 3 times before it fully sank in. Then I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I sat on the floor for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do. Finally, I took a screenshot of the text and sent it to Haley with a message saying she needed to see this before she married him. Then I turned off my phone and called in sick to work. Update 1: I know some of you wanted an update, so here it is. Things have gotten much worse than I expected. After I sent Haley the screenshot, I spent the rest of that day hiding in my apartment. I knew I had just blown up their wedding, but I couldn't let her marry him without knowing the truth. She deserved to know what kind of person she was about to commit her life to. Around 6 p.m. my phone started ringing. First it was Haley, then George, then Mom, then Haley's mom. I didn't answer any of the calls. I also had dozens of text messages, but I was too scared to read them. I finally turned my phone off completely and went to bed early. The next morning I had 47 missed calls and 83 text messages. The first one I read was from Mom asking me to call her immediately. Then I saw one from Haley's sister Lisa calling me horrible names and saying I had destroyed Haley's life. There were several from George begging me to call him back. I decided to call Mom first. She answered on the first ring and started crying immediately. She said Haley had called off the wedding and was refusing to see George. Apparently Haley had confronted him about the text and he admitted everything. He told her he had been fighting these feelings for years and thought getting married would help him move on. Haley told George she couldn't marry someone who was in love with another woman, especially when that woman was his own sister. She said the whole relationship felt like a lie now. She had spent 3 years thinking he loved her for who she was, but really she was just a substitute for me. Mom said Haley had gone to stay with her parents and wasn't answering calls from anyone in our family. George was devastated and kept asking Mom to call me and explain that he never meant for this to happen. He said the text was a drunken mistake and he never expected me to show it to Haley. I told Mom I had to show Haley because she deserved to know the truth before making the biggest decision of her life. Mom said she understood why I did it, but couldn't I have talked to George first instead of going straight to Haley? That's when it hit me that everyone was going to blame me for ruining the wedding instead of blaming George for his inappropriate feelings. I told Mom I needed time to think and hung up. Over the next few days, more family members started taking sides. Haley's immediate family was furious with George and with me for handling it the way I did. They said I should have kept the confession private and dealt with it within our family. George's friends were calling me crazy and saying I misunderstood a drunk text. Even some of our mutual relatives were saying I overreacted. The only person who seemed to understand was my Aunt Carol, Mom's sister. She called me a week after everything happened and said she was proud of me for protecting Haley even though it was a difficult situation. She said too many women end up in marriages where they're competing with ghosts and they never even know it. George kept trying to reach me, but I wasn't ready to talk to him. His texts went from apologetic to angry to desperate. He said I had ruined his life over a stupid drunk message that didn't mean anything. Then he said he was sorry and just wanted to explain. Then he said he was thinking about hurting himself because he had lost everything. That last message scared me enough to call Mom and tell her about it. She said she would check on him and maybe he needed professional help to work through his feelings. I told her I thought that was a good idea, but I still wasn't ready to talk to him myself. 2 weeks after the canceled wedding, Haley finally called me. She had been staying with her parents and taking time off work to figure out what she wanted to do next. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. She said she had been thinking about our conversation and she didn't blame me for showing her the text. She said the hardest part wasn't even that George had feelings for me. It was realizing that their entire relationship had been built on him settling for someone who reminded him of what he really wanted. She said she kept thinking about moments in their relationship that made more sense now, like how he would get quiet when I visited or how he always wanted to hear stories about what I was doing in Chicago. Haley said she was moving to another state to stay with her college roommate for a while. She had applied for teaching jobs there and wanted to start over somewhere that didn't remind her of George. She thanked me for being honest with her even though it was painful. I asked if she wanted to meet for coffee before she left, but she said she wasn't ready for that yet. She said she needed time to figure out who she was outside of the relationship with George, and being around our family would make that harder. George has been staying with his friend Marcus since Haley kicked him out of their apartment. Mom says he's still asking about me and wants to apologize in person. She thinks I should at least hear him out since he's family and he's struggling. I'm still not ready for that conversation. Every time I think about seeing him, I remember that text and feel sick again. How do you sit across from someone who confessed they've been in love with you since you were kids? How do you pretend that's normal family behavior? The wedding venue, caterer, and other vendors are keeping their deposit since it was cancelled so close to the date. George's name was on most of the contracts, so he's responsible for those costs. Mom said he's been picking up extra shifts to pay for everything, but it's going to take him months to clear the debt. Part of me feels bad about the financial burden, but another part of me thinks he brought this on himself. Haley shouldn't have to lose money because George couldn't control his inappropriate feelings. I'm planning to stay in Chicago through the holidays. Usually I come home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, but this year feels too complicated. Mom is disappointed, but she understands. She said she hopes things will settle down by next year and we can all find a way to move forward as a family. I don't know what moving forward looks like when your brother is in love with you and your cousin's life has been destroyed because of it. Some things can't be fixed with time and forgiveness. Update 2: I wasn't planning to post another update, but something happened that I think you should know about. It turns out the situation was more complicated than I originally thought. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from Haley's sister Lisa. We had never been particularly close, but she said she needed to talk to me about something important. She was in Chicago for a work conference and asked if we could meet for dinner. I was nervous about seeing her since she had sent me those angry texts right after the wedding was cancelled. But when we met, she seemed calm and said she owed me an apology. She said she had been angry at first because she thought I could have handled the situation differently, but after talking to Haley more, she understood why I did what I did. Then Lisa told me something that changed everything. She said Haley had suspected something was wrong with George for months before the wedding. Apparently George had been acting strange whenever my visits were mentioned. He would get moody or find excuses to not be around when I was coming to town. Haley had also noticed that George seemed to know a lot of details about my life that she hadn't shared with him. He would mention things about my job or my apartment that I had only told Haley. When Haley asked how he knew these things, George would say I must have mentioned them to him directly. But the biggest red flag was something that happened 2 months before the wedding. Haley had been looking at old photos to create a slideshow for the reception when she found a picture of me from high school in George's wallet. It was a photo from a family barbecue where I was wearing a blue dress and laughing at something someone had said. When Haley asked George about it, he said he carried it because it reminded him of happy family times. But Haley thought it was weird that he had a photo of me specifically instead of a family group photo or a picture of both of us together. Lisa said Haley had been planning to talk to me about her concerns during my next visit, but then George sent that text and everything exploded. She said Haley felt like the text confirmed what she had already been suspecting but was afraid to admit to herself. This information made me realize that George's feelings weren't just a recent thing that came up during wedding planning. He had been carrying them around for years and doing a poor job of hiding them. Haley had been living with the anxiety of sensing something was wrong but not knowing what it was. Lisa also told me that George had been trying to contact Haley ever since she moved away. He had been sending her long emails apologizing and begging her to give him another chance. He promised he would get counseling and work on his issues. Haley had been forwarding these emails to Lisa because she didn't know how to respond. In the emails, George kept saying that his feelings for me were just a phase and that he really loved Haley. He said the stress of the wedding had made him confused and he didn't mean anything he wrote in that text. He claimed he had been drinking and was just nervous about getting married. But Lisa said there was one email where George's story changed. He wrote that he had always cared about me as a sister but had been going through a difficult time at work and was looking for excuses to avoid getting married. He said he made up the story about being in love with me because he thought it would be easier than admitting he was scared of commitment. Haley didn't believe this new version of events. She said George had been too specific in his original text for it to be something he made up. Plus, it didn't explain why he had been carrying my photo or why he knew so much about my personal life. After Lisa told me all this, I started thinking about my own interactions with George differently. I remembered times when he would ask me personal questions about my dating life or my plans for the future. I had thought he was just being a caring brother, but now I wondered if there was more to it. I also remembered that George had always been weird about my boyfriends. In college, when I brought guys home to meet the family, George would barely speak to them. I thought he was just being protective, but maybe it was jealousy. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Had George been viewing me differently this whole time? Had I missed signs that he was developing inappropriate feelings? Last week, Mom called to tell me that George had been asking about my Christmas plans. He wanted to know if I was coming home for the holidays and if I would be willing to talk to him. Mom said he seemed genuinely sorry and was seeing a counselor to work through his issues. I told Mom I wasn't ready to see George yet and that I was still processing everything Lisa had told me. Mom said she understood but reminded me that George was still my brother and family should stick together during difficult times. That conversation bothered me because it felt like Mom was more concerned about keeping the family together than acknowledging how inappropriate George's behavior had been. I started to wonder if other family members were minimizing the situation because they didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of it. I decided to call Haley directly to see how she was doing. We talked for over an hour and she sounded much better than she had in our previous conversation. She said she was settling into her new job and had started making friends in her new city. She was also seeing someone, which was good to hear. Haley told me she didn't regret calling off the wedding and that she was grateful I had shown her the truth. She said the hardest part had been wondering if she was overreacting, but talking to Lisa and her new therapist had helped her understand that her feelings were valid. She also said she hoped I wouldn't let George's issues affect my relationship with the rest of the family. She said what happened wasn't my fault and I shouldn't have to isolate myself because of George's inappropriate behavior. I appreciated Haley saying that, but the truth is that I do feel isolated from my family now. Every conversation with Mom or other relatives feels loaded with unspoken tension. Everyone seems to be walking on eggshells and hoping things will just go back to normal. But I don't think things can go back to normal. George crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Even if he gets help and learns to manage his feelings, I will always know that he spent years viewing me inappropriately while I trusted him as my brother. I'm still planning to stay in Chicago for the holidays. Mom is disappointed, but I think it's the right decision for now. Maybe next year I'll feel differently, but right now I need space to figure out how to move forward. Update 3. This will be my last update because I think I've finally reached a resolution with this situation, even though it's not the kind of resolution anyone in my family wanted. Right after New Year's, George showed up at my apartment in Chicago unannounced. I was getting ready for work when someone knocked on my door. When I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there, my stomach dropped. I didn't open the door at first and asked what he was doing there. He said he had driven all night because he couldn't stand things being weird between us anymore. He said he needed to apologize in person and explain what had really happened. I told him through the door that I wasn't ready to have that conversation and he needed to leave. George started crying and said he had been miserable for months. He said he had lost his fiancée, his apartment, and now his sister because of one stupid mistake. He promised that if I would just listen to him for 10 minutes, he would never bother me again. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. George looked terrible. He had lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. He was wearing the same clothes he had probably driven in and his hair was messy. I let him come inside, but I didn't offer him coffee or ask him to sit down. George immediately started apologizing and saying the text had been a huge mistake. He said he had been drinking heavily that night because he was nervous about the wedding and scared about making such a big commitment. He claimed he had always loved me as a sister, but the alcohol had made him confuse those feelings with something else. I stopped him and said I knew about the photo of me in his wallet and the fact that he had been acting strange around me for months. I told him Lisa had filled me in on Haley's concerns and his story about being drunk and confused didn't add up. That's when George's demeanor changed. He got defensive and said Haley had been paranoid and looking for problems that weren't there. He said the photo was innocent and that Haley had been jealous of our close relationship as siblings. He said she had been trying to come between us for years and was happy to have an excuse to break up with him. I told George that was a terrible thing to say about Haley and that she had every right to be concerned about his behavior. I said even if his feelings had been innocent, the way he expressed them in the text was completely inappropriate. George got angry then and said I was being dramatic. He said families go through rough patches and we should be able to work through this together. He said by shutting him out, I was abandoning him when he needed me most. I told George that I wasn't abandoning him, but I also couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. I said his text had made me deeply uncomfortable and I needed time to process what it meant for our relationship going forward. George said he would give me space if that's what I needed, but he asked if I could at least promise that we would eventually work things out. He said he couldn't stand the thought of losing me permanently over something he wrote when he was drunk and emotional. I told George the first couldn't make any promises about the future, but I would try to stay in touch with him through Mom and other family members. I said direct contact between us needed to be limited for now while I figured out how to move forward. George looked like he was going to cry again, but he nodded and said he understood. He asked if he could hug me goodbye and I said no. He stood there for a moment like he was going to argue, but then he just said he loved me and left. After George left, I called Mom and told her what had happened. She was upset that he had shown up without warning but said she was glad we had finally talked. She asked if I felt better about the situation now that I had heard his side of the story. I told Mom I didn't feel better at all. George's explanation didn't make sense and his reaction when I pushed back had made me more uncomfortable, not less. Mom said she thought George was just frustrated and didn't mean to get defensive. That conversation made me realize that my family was never going to fully understand why George's behavior had been so problematic. They wanted me to forgive him and move on because it was easier than acknowledging that he had crossed a serious boundary. 2 weeks later, Mom called to tell me that George had been arrested for drunk driving. He had been at a bar near his work and tried to drive home. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but his license was suspended and he had to spend a night in jail. Mom was worried about George and said she thought he was drinking too much because he was depressed about our family situation. She asked if I would consider calling him because she thought hearing from me might help him get back on track. I told Mom that George's drinking problem wasn't my responsibility and I wasn't going to enable his behavior by treating him like a victim. I said he was an adult who needed to face the consequences of his choices. Mom got quiet and said she was disappointed in my attitude. She said George had made mistakes but he was still my brother and family should support each other through difficult times. She said she had raised me to be more compassionate than this. That conversation was the breaking point for me. I realized that my family was more invested in maintaining the appearance of normalcy than in acknowledging that George's behavior had been inappropriate and harmful. I told Mom I needed to take a break from our family for a while. I said I would still call her occasionally to check in, but I wasn't going to participate in family gatherings or discussions about George until further notice. Mom started crying and said I was tearing the family apart. She said George was already struggling and losing me would make things worse for him. I told her that wasn't my problem to solve and hung up. It's been 2 months since that conversation and I've only talked to Mom twice. Both times she tried to update me on George's situation and ask when I was planning to come home. I told her I didn't want to hear about George and I didn't have any plans to visit. Haley and I have stayed in touch and she's doing well in her new city. She's still seeing the guy she mentioned before and they seem happy together. She said she's grateful to be away from all the family drama and doesn't regret her decision to start over somewhere else. Last week, I got a text from George's friend Marcus saying George had been asking about me and wondering if I would be willing to meet him for coffee when I was next in town. I didn't respond to the text. I know some people will think I'm being too harsh or that I should give George another chance since he's family. But I've come to understand that just because someone is related to you doesn't mean you have to accept inappropriate behavior from them. George's feelings for me, whether they were romantic or just confused, created a situation where I no longer feel comfortable being around him. His inability to take full responsibility for his actions and his family's willingness to minimize what happened have made it clear that this isn't something that can be easily resolved. I'm doing well in Chicago and I've been focusing on building a life that doesn't revolve around my family's drama. I have good friends here and I'm happy with my job. I miss some aspects of home, but I don't miss the stress and awkwardness that comes with navigating George's issues. I may reconsider my position in the future, but for now, I'm content with the boundaries I've set. Sometimes protecting yourself means disappointing the people you love, and I've learned that's okay.